Okay. So this is what we were doing on Friday. We were looking at this issue of what's the halacha when someone's tree is growing into my property. Either it's creating inconvenient branches growing into my property, or it's creating a nuisance growing into my house or growing into my shed or doing all of these things. And we saw that there's actually a machlokes on this matter um, among the Rishonim, but it seems to be that the psak, that the consensus is that since it's a slow-growing source of damage that starts on my property but slow grows into your property, it is up to the person whose property is being damaged to cut off and distance the branches. In other words, it's the neighbor's responsibility to cut the branches off. Okay, and it's a very, very long. Well, actually, so I just want to jump down to sort of the bottom line. He says, "V'hinei be'emes yesh li tmoa de besof perak lo yachbar chavzayin amadbeis ditnan ilan shehunota listei chavero katzeitz malo hamardeya al gabe hamacharesha v'chulei." So there's one Mishnah in Bava Basra that states that if you have a tree that is growing into your friend's field, you're allowed to cut off of that neighbor's field malo hamardeya, the thickness of the apparatus that is surrounding the plow. Let me just bring up the Mishnah so that you can all see it. Yes. So let's take a look at this Mishnah. It's the second chapter of Bava Metzia.
Because of the roots, no? Not because of the branches. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. What we want the Talmud. There we go, Talmud. Bava Batra 27b. Right, Elon Shehunota. Let me see if I can share this with you. Here we go. That with regard to a tree that leans into the field of another, the neighbor may cut the branches to the height of an ox goad raised over the plow in places where the land is to be plowed, so that the branches do not impede the use of the plow. Okay, so that's the first statement that is made in the Mishnah over there. And then the Imrei Yaakov says, "Umiyad achar kach b'Mishnah beistanan, Ilan shehunota l'rishos harabim." And then the very next case is in the very next Mishnah. It says, "Tanan Ilan shehunota l'rishos harabim kotzeitz kedei sheyehi gamal over v'rochvo v'chulei." That if you have a tree that is protruding into the public thoroughfare, then you are allowed to cut off, he's obligated to cut the branches such that it does not impede a camel and its rider going through the public thoroughfare. Umistimas chazal mashma debishnehem hadin shaveh. It sounds like from what our sages tell us that these laws are agreed upon and that they are not in conflict with each other. The Gam HaBeit Yosef b'Shulchan Aruch Hetich Shnei Hadinim b'Samach Zelazeh, the Besif Chavav Hevi Din Kamaisa Heichad Ilanot L'Rishus Hayachid, Ubesif Chavzayin Hetigdin Rishus Harabim. It says that makes no difference whether the tree is protruding into a private property or into a public property. The halacha is the same. Ustam v'sasam hadvarim mibeli levaram, and he explains this without he brings these halachas down without explaining them properly. In other words, it seems like from these halachos that it's incumbent upon the tree owner to cut these things down, even though we said before that it's incumbent upon the person who was being impeded or inconvenienced to cut them himself. And so this is the problem, is that on the one hand, we have a Mishnah which says that if my tree is growing into your property, it's your job to distance yourself from my branches or cut the branches yourself. You hire the arborist. But at the same time, it seems like from this halacha that regardless of whether it's growing into a Rishus HaYachid or Rishus HaRabim, either a private property or a public property, the obligation is upon the tree owner. However, we could make the following distinction. He says, we could suggest that if the tree is protruding into a public thoroughfare, then the obligation of trimming back the tree is incumbent upon the owner of the tree. Okay, because no one really has dominion over a public thoroughfare, and therefore it reverts back to the owner whose tree is causing a nuisance to the public thoroughfare. We place the onus upon him. And we would have to explain that Mishnah that says that if it's growing into a private property such that I can't plow, then it's really, even though the language is misleading, it really means that the owner, the neighbor, has to be the one to trim the tree. So the point that I just wanted to bring at the end is that there is a distinction being drawn in this halacha between whether the damage that originates at my house is growing out into a public thoroughfare or to a private thoroughfare. When it grows out into a public thoroughfare, then it's incumbent upon the owner of the tree to manage the growth. When it's growing into my neighbor's property, then technically I can tell the neighbor, if you're unhappy about my tree, just hire a gardener or get on a ladder and cut it yourself. So that's the halachic bottom line. Now, of course, there are going to be instances where my neighbor is a 98-year-old woman and she complains to me that my tree is growing into her property and she doesn't have the wherewithal to hire somebody. So I have to know when to go beyond the letter of the law and when to practice the letter of the law. Okay, I just wanted to make sure we understand that. That's also a good question. If the fruit, I don't remember immediately, but logic dictates that since I have the right to cut the branches, I have the right to keep everything that's on the branches as a neighbor. That would logically be what we would conclude, but I'm not sure. I can't say for sure until we see the halacha inside, but I believe that would be the halacha. Okay. So let's see. You should not cause damage to your neighbor unless the neighbor is willing to forego the damage. He says, "V'yesh levarer im rashai adam liftach bevinyan megorim marpeah shabohu mekabel cholim." Is it permissible? We really started to look into this before when we saw the Pischei Choshen. Can my neighbor, open up a health clinic, where he sees patients? Can he do that and create additional foot traffic? V'cheini mutar liftoch gan yeladim mibli lekabel et haskamat hashchenim. And is a person allowed to open up a daycare center without getting the consent of the neighbors? Uchedei levarer hilchat hadah. So in order to clarify this particular halacha, naktim haditnan b'Bava Basra chafa medbeis. Let's first look at a Mishnah that is in Bava Basra 20b. Chanut shebechatzer yachol limchot. So let's just look that up on Sefaria once again. I'll just move it back to page 20b, and I'll share you the screen. Okay, here. Okay, let me just. Okay. The Mishnah states as follows: Lo yiftach adam chanut shel nachtomim. I think that's what we're looking at. Let me just double check. Let me just see if this is the one. Okay, here it is. I believe this is it. Lo yiftach adam chanut shel nachtomim v'shel tzabaim tachad otzaro shel chavero. The Mishnah says a person may not open a bakery or a dye shop beneath the storeroom of another, and he may not establish a cattle barn there, as these produce heat, smoke, and odors which rise and damage the items in the storeroom. The Mishnah comments, in truth, the halacha is that in the case of a storeroom of wine, the sages rendered it permitted to set up a bakery and a dye shop beneath, as the heat that rises does not damage the wine. But they did not render it permitted to establish a cattle barn because its odor damages the wine. Okay, so I think that's the Mishnah that he's making reference to. Chanut shebechatzer yachol limchot v'lomar lo, that if you have a store that's in a courtyard, the store shop owner can protest and he can say, let me just share back now the PDF. Store shop owner can say, Eini yachol lishan mikol hanichnasim mikol hayotzeim. He can say, I can't sleep because of the neighbor can say, I can't sleep from the sound of the people coming in and out. So we looked at the wrong Mishnah. Let me just see if there's another Mishnah. Oh, sorry. Let me go back and share with you the next Mishnah. Okay. Chanut shebechatzer yochol limchot biyado v'lomar lo. If you have a store that's in a courtyard, if a resident wants to open a store in his courtyard, his neighbor can protest to prevent him from doing so and say to him, I am unable to sleep due to the sound of people entering the store and the sound of people exiting. But one may fashion utensils in his house and go out and sell them in the market, despite the fact that he is not allowed to set up a store in the courtyard, and the neighbor cannot protest against him doing so and say to him, I am unable to sleep due to the sound of the hammer you use to fashion utensils. Nor can he say, I cannot sleep due to the sound of the mill that you use to grind, nor can he say, I cannot sleep due to the sound of the children. It is permitted for one to make reasonable use of his home. And that's really the basis of what we had seen before from the Chazon Ish, that as long as it's reasonable use of the house, it's okay. So this forms the foundation of this discussion in halacha. Because of Hamenemuke Yosef, the lav dafka mishum hakol, the lishna ba'al mahudinakar el mipnei shemar b'leim haderech, the chen kasav harashba v'od risham. As we've seen before, the issue with the customers coming into the guy's house when he opens up a clinic or a daycare is that he's creating crowding and makes it inconvenient for a person to access his home, and just extends the accessibility. He makes it more inaccessible for his neighbor to get to his house. But a neighbor cannot complain about the sound and say, I can't sleep because of the hammer or the mill or the babies that are crying. So the Gemara asks the question, what's the difference? Why are you allowed to protest when a person creates a lot of foot traffic, but you're not allowed to protest when a neighbor is making noise? So Rava says, because the case of the children where you're not allowed to protest is because the guy is doing a mitzvah. He opened up a cheder in his home. Okay, remember we saw this whole issue. Can you open up a shtibel? Is the shtibel the same thing? Because of Hatur Siman Kufnun Vav, the Lav Dafka Tinochos Shel Beis Rabban, El Hahud Hadin Nami Lechol Mili de Mitzvah, Kagon Lechaleg Tzedaka, Oli Tpalel Ba'asara. And the Beit Yosef, the Tur writes that this is not just for opening up a cheder. You can, any type of activity that you're doing that involves a mitzvah is included in this, to give out, like giving out tzedakah, or to daven with a minyan, you can open up a shtibel. So really, we started doing the research on this last week. If you recall, we were researching this in the Pischei Choshen because we saw him bring this down in concise form in the Likutim, but now he's going more in depth in this shaila, so we might as well follow down this rabbit hole, see where it takes us. V'hosef habeis Yosef al dvar v'zel shano, u'masha kosav rabbeinu duhu adin l'chol mili d'mitzvah v'chulei kein kosav haritva b'tshuva, the lavdafka malami tinokol shalbeis rabban elohu adin lasos medrash lahar bitz Torah o lidrosh bolarabim k'dei lahagdol Torah lahadir. And the Beis Yosef quotes the Ritva, who says that this is really the halacha, is that anything that you're doing to be marbitz Torah, or to encourage people to do mitzvot, or that you're doing a mitzvah in the process, you're spreading the word of Torah, is permitted for you, and no neighbor can protest, even if it creates a nuisance. And that's the reason why you can't protest. And therefore, based on that, he says, we don't want the Torah to be forgotten, and so important it is to preserve Torah study and Torah practice that no neighbor can protest when a fellow Jew is engaged in a mitzvah, which is a very, very sweeping kind of permissibility that's granted. Huge amount of latitude is granted to a neighbor to do whatever he wants as long as he's doing a mitzvah. V'chein pasak ledina b'shulchan aruch sham sif gimel v'zel shono. V'chein yesh lo lami tinoko shel yisur Torah b'toch beiso. The Shulchan Aruch says explicitly, you're allowed to set up a cheder in your house. Remember, we said it wasn't clear whether it's a one-room cheder or whether you can establish a multi-room cheder with multiple teachers, which is even more noise and more traffic. We also said it's unclear whether this only applies to children because you're teaching them Torah, special dispensation for Yeshua ben Gamla, or whether it applies to other mitzvahs. So first of all, you should remember that there's a whole litany of opinions that we've already seen on this matter. There's a wide variety of different shades of what's permitted that my neighbor can do. Ve'ein hashchenim yicholim limchos biyado v'lomar lo ein anu yicholim lishon mikol hatinokos shel beis rabban v'hu adin l'chol mili demitzvah shenim yicholim limchos biyado ad kan l'shana. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch makes that statement that no neighbor can protest if you open up a cheder. So he says, v'hinei Masha Kosav HaBeis Yosef the Das HaRitva Hu Kedas HaTur Dehu Adin L'Chol Mili De Mitzvah Dover Zeh Kasha. So first of all, what the Beis Yosef quoted the Ritva is saying, that the Beis Yosef says that the Ritva holds like the Tur, and that all other mitzvah activity is something that cannot be protested. Dover Zeh Kasha Dehari Pashtus Mashmos HaRitva Hu Dedafka B'Lima Torah Din Kain. So first of all, that's difficult to align oneself with, to reconcile, because the Ritva does not give such a sweeping heter as any mitzvah is permitted. He just says any Talmud Torah activity is permitted. He says anything that will proliferate the study of Torah is permitted and no neighbors can protest. So that's true whether it comes to teaching children or teaching adults. Adult education centers can be opened up also by a neighbor and no one can protest. The mashma dafka limud haTorah ch'mosh amar sham begemara zocher oso ish latov Yeshua ben Gamla shemo she'il moli hu nishtakach Torah miYisrael. That, and this is really based on the Gemara that discusses Yeshua ben Gamla's activity, who set up the yeshiva system. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on hold. I want to come back to this Amir Hashem tomorrow. We're going to continue through this and really try to get to the bottom line, because this is really very, very practical. How far can you go as a neighbor to say, I'm doing a mitzvah, I'm saving the world, I'm doing God's work, and therefore you don't have a right to protest? Okay, we'll hold it here for today.